The numbers that started the panic emerged at 6:47 a.m. Central Standard Time on March 4, 2026. At a routine Environment and Climate Change Canada water level monitoring station in Thunder Bay, Ontario, an automated sensor registered a reading that the system flagged as a critical error. The water level of Lake Superior had dropped 1.3 centimeters in less than 12 hours. In the context of the world's largest freshwater lake by surface area, a 1.3 centimeter drop is not a fluctuation, it is a geological impossibility. Superior surface area across the Canadian and bordering reaches covers approximately 82,100 square kilometers. A uniform drop of that magnitude represents a volume of water so staggering that the technician on duty, a veteran hydrologist named Sarah Bellinger, ran the manual calibration 3 times before notifying the Geological Survey of Canada. She was looking at the overnight disappearance of approximately 427 million cubic meters of water, roughly 113 billion gallons. This is not the 4.7 million gallons per hour that would eventually become the terrifying baseline of this crisis. That number would come later, representing a localized flow rate into the abyss. This initial reading was the first sign of a systemic hemorrhaging that has, in the weeks since, forced federal emergency management agencies in Ottawa to operate in a state of what insiders call controlled atmospheric dread. What scientists saw in last week's data changes everything we understood about the structural integrity of the Canadian Shield. This is not a slow recession driven by evaporation, which ECCC models account for at roughly 1.8 millimeters per day in early March. It is not a diversion through the St. Mary's River, where the Sault Ste. Marie locks and hydro dams are monitored with millimetric precision by the International Superior Board of Control. The water is simply gone. By March 6, additional monitoring stations at Terrace Bay, Marathon, and Michipicoten confirmed the anomaly was accelerating. The drop was consistent, directional, and localized toward the deep central basin. By March 8, the rate was calculated with enough precision to send shock waves through the Natural Resources Canada headquarters. 4.7 million gallons were vanishing every single hour into a void that should not exist. This is not a drought. This is not a climate anomaly. What is happening right now beneath the surface of Lake Superior is a geophysical autopsy of a continent, revealing a hidden architecture that has remained undetected for 150 years of modern science. The scale of the loss is so vast that when the first sonar returns from the deep floor were processed, the researchers at the Pacific Geoscience Center, assisting with the remote analysis, initially refused to file the report. They assumed the equipment had suffered a catastrophic pressure failure, but the sensors were functioning perfectly. They were simply recording the first stages of a great lake beginning to drain into the earth like a bathtub with a cracked floor. We are witnessing the largest hydrological disaster in North American history, unfolding in real time, and the clock is not just ticking, it is accelerating. The discovery of the tunnel is where the story stops being about water loss statistics and becomes something that will genuinely keep you up at night. On March 10, 2026, an emergency underwater survey was launched by Natural Resources Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada. They deployed 2 specialized vessels, the CCGS Limnos, a workhorse of the Canadian Coast Guard's research fleet, and the CCGS Kelso, a high-end hydrographic platform. Their mission was to conduct deep-floor multi-beam mapping along Superior Central Basin, north of the international boundary in the Michipicoten Hole, the deepest part of the lake. The survey was designed to rule out the obvious explanations: fault displacement along the mid-continent rift, seabed fracturing, or sediment channel migration. The scientists were hoping to find something boring, something within the realm of known Canadian geology. They were not hoping to find what they found. At approximately 2:43 in the afternoon on March 11th, the Kelsos multi-beam sonar array, operating at a depth of nearly 400 meters below the surface, detected an anomalous return signal in grid sector 7, roughly 60 kilometers south of Michipicoten Island. The operator, a GAC contractor named Pete Varga, and Pete, your data is currently being analyzed by every geologist from St. John's to Victoria, flagged the reading and requested a second pass. The second pass confirmed the impossible. There is a hole in the floor of Lake Superior. Not a small breach, not a geological pore or a sediment gap. A tunnel entrance measuring approximately 21 meters in diameter. Its walls display the smooth, sculpted curvature that geologists associate with one specific and deeply alarming process: the long-term dissolution of carbonate rock by acidic water moving under immense pressure. The sonar return from inside the tunnel extended downward at an angle of 22 degrees before the signal scattered, meaning the tunnel continues beyond the instrument's effective penetration depth. They cannot see the bottom. They cannot see where the water is going. By the time both vessels rendezvoused and the lead scientists shared their data, the mood on those ships had shifted from professional urgency to a chilling silence. Within 24 hours, emergency sonar data from additional survey passes mapped a tunnel system of staggering scale. The primary entrance is just the beginning. Secondary mapping identifies at least 7 additional apertures along a corridor stretching 22 kilometers across the central basin floor. The largest secondary entrance measures 9.5 meters across. The smallest is just under 3 meters, still large enough, as one GSC internal memo notes, to accommodate continuous high-volume fluid transfer at the rates being observed. The main tunnel descends into what preliminary geological modeling suggests is a massive prehistoric void network within the bedrock. To understand what is happening beneath the Canadian portion of Lake Superior, you need to understand karstification. This occurs when slightly acidic groundwater moves through soluble rock, limestone or dolomite, dissolving it over millennia. The world knows this process from the cave systems of the Bruce Peninsula or the karst landscapes of Nova Scotia. But the entire framework of Canadian shield geology explicitly argued against this happening here. Superior sits on a billion-year-old basement of granite and basalt, ancient, crystalline, and geologically stubborn. However, the sonar data is currently rewriting the textbooks in real time. The tunnel system does not originate in the igneous basement. It originates in a previously unmapped, buried carbonate intrusion layer. A band of ancient limestone deposited during a marine event hundreds of millions of years ago was trapped beneath the volcanic rock of the mid-continent rift. It was hidden from every seismic survey conducted in Ontario's history because the heavy basalt above it scattered the signals, acting as a geological shroud. Dr. Linda Okafor, a geomorphologist at the University of Waterloo, who was rushed into the emergency task force, describes the formation in terms that are equal parts scientifically precise and terrifying. We are looking at a regional-scale karst conduit system operating within a buried carbonate aquifer we didn't know existed. It is feeding water from the lake floor through dissolution tunnels into a deep void network that is actively expanding under current hydraulic pressure. Actively expanding. Every hour that 17,800 cubic meters of water pours through it, the acidic water is dissolving the walls further. The process that took thousands of years to build this tunnel is now being dramatically accelerated by the sheer volume of water moving through it. This is no longer a geological feature. It has become a self-sustaining, high-pressure hydraulic drill, eating into the heart of the continent. To grasp the sheer audacity of what is happening in the central basin, one must look past the surface and into the deep time statistics of Canadian geology. While 4.7 million gallons per hour sounds like a localized leak, the systemic implications are a nightmare of coupled physical forces. For comparison, consider the Horseshoe Falls at Niagara. At peak flow, Niagara discharges approximately 2.8 million liters per second. The superior drain, at roughly 17.8 million liters per hour, is significantly smaller in volume, but it represents a categorical departure from the hydrological cycle. In Niagara, the water remains in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence system. It is surface-to-surface transfer. Beneath the Michipicoten hole, the water is entering a black box subterranean void. It is exiting the biosphere's immediate cycle entirely. The Geological Survey of Canada is currently attempting to model the lithostatic release effect, the phenomenon where the removal of billions of tons of water weight causes the Earth's crust to flex upward. In the Canadian North, we see this as isostatic rebound from the last ice age, occurring at millimeters per century. We are now seeing localized crustal deformation occurring in weeks. The historical parallels are few and terrifying. In 1996, the Saguenay floods proved how quickly Canadian infrastructure can fail when water defies its traditional boundaries. But that was surface level. To find a parallel for the tunnel, scientists are looking at the 1929 Grand Banks earthquake and the subsequent underwater landslides. That event proved that the stable North Atlantic margin could experience massive sudden displacement. Now the GSC is looking at the stable Canadian shield with the same newfound suspicion. Dr. Alistair McInnes, a senior seismologist with Natural Resources Canada, noted in a March 14th internal briefing that the structural integrity of the Great Lakes Basin is predicated on the weight of the water acting as a stabilizing cap over the mid-continent rift. With that cap being compromised, the internal pressures of the rift's ancient fault lines are beginning to shift. This brings us to the Project Boreas simulation, a high-intensity computational model run by the University of Toronto's Department of Earth Sciences. The model was designed to predict the long-term effects of this drain on the St. Lawrence corridor. The results, released to federal officials on March 18th, suggest a cascading hydraulic failure. Because the Great Lakes are a stepped system, the loss in Superior triggers a pressure drop that propagates through the Sault Ste. Marie locks. If Superior's level drops by more than 45 centimeters, the hydroelectric turbines at the W.A. Smith generating station and other Ontario power generation facilities will begin to experience cavitation, a process where vacuum bubbles implode against turbine blades, shattering them. We aren't just losing water, we are looking at the potential decapitation of the Ontario power grid. But here is the scientific twist that has the GSC in a state of disbelief. Isotope analysis of the water disappearing through the tunnel suggests it isn't just sitting in a cave. Initial geochemical traces detected at a deep crustal monitoring well near Sudbury, nearly 300 kilometers away, show signatures of Superior surface water arriving in less than 72 hours. This implies the tunnel isn't a dead-end void. It is a high-speed pressurized conduit, a geological superhighway cutting through the Precambrian basement. We have discovered a secondary subterranean drainage system for North America that has been dormant for eons and has suddenly, for reasons still being debated, switched on. The cyclicity of this event is the ultimate unknown. Some GSC researchers argue this is a relic drainage event that hasn't occurred since the Mesoproterozoic era, while others fear we have triggered a permanent structural breach. The forecast models are no longer predicting if the water will reach a new equilibrium. They are trying to determine if the entire central basin of the lake is essentially a giant sinkhole in waiting. As of this morning, the drain rate has not leveled off. It is following a logarithmic curve upward. The more water flows through, the wider the conduit becomes, and the faster the lake bleeds. We are not just watching a lake drain. We are watching the mechanical failure of a tectonic plate. The human stakes of this geological hemorrhage are no longer theoretical. To understand the immediate impact on the ground, you have to meet people like Thomas Badzicki. Thomas is 53 years old, a member of the Fort William First Nation near Thunder Bay, Ontario. His family has fished the north shore of Lake Superior for 4 generations. His grandfather pulled nets near the Slate Islands. His father taught him how to read the surface of the water before he could read a textbook. Thomas has spent his life believing that Superior was the one constant in an ever-changing world. A body of water so vast it was effectively an inland sea, immune to the whims of men. On March 14, 2026, Thomas pulled his nets and found them half empty. But that wasn't what scared him. What scared him was that his 40-foot commercial tug grounded on a shoal near the Welcome Islands that was marked as having 6 meters of clearance on his latest Canadian Hydrographic Service charts. The shoal hadn't moved. The water had simply left. "The lake feels hollow," Thomas told the reporter from the Chronicle Journal. "There's a vibration in the hull that wasn't there last season. It's like the water is being pulled from underneath, not just sitting there." Thomas doesn't know about the GSC's tunnel discovery yet. The federal information embargo is still largely holding, but his experience is the first data point in a social collapse. The economic exposure for Canada is staggering. The port of Thunder Bay is the largest freshwater port in the country, a critical artery for the movement of Western Canadian grain to international markets. Every year, millions of tons of wheat, potash, and iron ore move through these docks. The shipping industry in the Great Lakes generates approximately $35 billion in economic activity annually, and Superior handles the heaviest bulk. But shipping is a game of inches. A drop of just 30 centimeters in navigable depth forces the massive lakers to reduce their cargo loads by thousands of tons to avoid hitting the bottom of the St. Mary's River or the harbor approach. The Chamber of Marine Commerce estimates that if the current drain rate holds, the loss in cargo capacity will cost the Canadian economy upwards of $210 million Canadian dollars per month in logistical delays and supply chain friction. 400 kilometers to the east, in the town of Marathon, Ontario, the crisis is even more visceral. Marc-André Tremblay, the city's lead engineer, is a man who deals in cold, hard metrics. He has spent 22 years maintaining the municipal water intake that extends deep into the lake to provide fresh water for the town's 3,000 residents and its local industry. On March 16th, Marc-André sat in a closed-door meeting with the mayor and representatives from Public Safety Canada. He presented a graph that showed his intake margin, the critical buffer between the surface and the point where the pumps begin to suck air, had narrowed by 11% in just 14 days. "We are engineered for seasonal fluctuations," Tremblay noted in his report. "We are not engineered for a systemic evacuation of the basin. If the water drops another 90 centimeters, the town of Marathon loses its primary water source. There is no plan B. You can't drill wells into the Canadian Shield granite fast enough to replace a Great Lake." The psychological toll is manifesting in what sociologists are calling the superior silence. In communities like Wawa, Terrace Bay, and Nipigon, there is a growing sense of dread as the shoreline recedes, exposing ancient shipwrecks and submerged forests that haven't seen the sun in 1,000 years. The ecological impact is equally devastating. Superior's cold, deep-water ecosystem is the foundation for Canada's most productive freshwater fisheries: lake trout, whitefish, and cisco. These species rely on specific thermal layers and spawning grounds in the shallows. As the water level drops and the lake's thermal structure is disrupted by the high-pressure suction of the tunnel system, those populations are beginning to migrate or die off. Behind the scenes, the Canadian government's response has been one of controlled panic. Under the authority of the Emergency Management Act, the federal government has quietly pre-positioned assets from the Canadian Armed Forces under a modified Operation Lentus framework. This isn't for a forest fire or a flood. It is for the potential failure of regional infrastructure. Mobile water treatment units are being staged in Sudbury, ready to be deployed to North Shore towns. The Ontario Power Generation, OPG, has established a 24-hour monitoring cell at the Sir Adam Beck complex to model the downstream effects on the St. Lawrence hydro system. If Superior continues to drain, The head of water that drives the turbines at Sault Ste. Marie and beyond will vanish. We are looking at a regional blackout that could leave millions of Ontarians in the dark, all because a 21-meter hole opened in the floor of a lake that science told us was indestructible. The logistics of moving water, power, and food to these isolated northern communities if the lake fails are nearly impossible. The Trans-Canada Highway, the only major artery connecting east and west, hugs the Superior shoreline for hundreds of kilometers. If the seismic instability caused by the tunnel leads to coastal landslides or seiches, massive standing waves, the road itself could be severed. We are watching the potential balkanization of Canada, as the geological floor beneath our most vital resource simply gives way. As we look towards the horizon of 2027 and beyond, the question isn't whether we can stop the draining of Lake Superior, but how we will survive the landscape it leaves behind. By early 2027, the initial rate of 17.8 million liters per hour, a number that once caused panic, is remembered as a period of relative stability. The combined forces of hydromechanical erosion and chemical dissolution have done their work. The primary tunnel entrance, once 21 meters across, has widened by an estimated 19% as the pressurized water scours the buried carbonate layer. The Geological Survey of Canada now classifies this as the Superior Drainage Event, SDE, a permanent structural breach in the North American Craton. The engineering response has reached a point of honest, albeit devastating surrender. The concept of deep grouting, once touted by federal committees in Ottawa as a potential fix, was abandoned after a pilot project near the Michipicoten Hole failed in spectacular fashion. The high-velocity flow simply stripped the curing agents from the cement before they could bond to the rock, carrying the slurry deep into the subcrustal void network. It was, as one lead engineer from the WSP Global Task Force described it, trying to plug a volcanic vent with wet sand. The future risks are not limited to the water itself. They are spreading into the very ground the region is built upon. The Canadian National Seismograph Network, CNSN, has identified a fracture corridor extending north-northeast from the central basin toward the town of Nipigon. This isn't just a tunnel anymore. It is a developing subterranean canyon. As the void expands, the weight of the overlying igneous rock is becoming unsupported. We are now seeing the first signs of regional subsidence. In the summer of 2027, long-range GNSS sensors placed along the North Shore began recording downward vertical displacement of 2.4 centimeters per month. This is not the slow, millimetric movement geologists are used to. This is the structural failure of the Canadian Shield. The vulnerability of the Trans-Canada Highway, the singular umbilical cord connecting eastern and western Canada, is now the primary concern of Public Safety Canada. If a localized collapse occurs where the highway hugs the cliffs near Rossport, the national supply chain is severed instantly. The rail lines, both Canadian National and CPKC, are facing similar risks. The stable bedrock that supported the expansion of a nation is being hollowed out from within, and there is no engineering fix for a continent that is losing its foundation. The economic reality by 2028 will be a transformation of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway. The port of Thunder Bay, once a bustling hub for the world's grain, will likely be reduced to a series of landlocked elevators by the decade's end. The Lakers that once drafted 9 meters of water will be a memory, replaced by smaller, shallow draft barges, if the shipping lanes can be maintained at all. The cost to the Canadian economy in lost tonnage, infrastructure repair, and energy replacement is projected by the Bank of Canada to exceed 45 billion Canadian dollars over the next 5 years. But the dollar figure pales in comparison to the ecological finality. Lake Superior is the anchor of the Great Lakes system. It holds 10% of the world's surface fresh water. As it drains, the hydraulic head that pushes water through the St. Mary's River into Lake Huron will diminish. We are looking at a downward pressure on the entire Great Lakes basin. The Niagara Escarpment, the St. Lawrence River, the very water that flows past the Parliament buildings in Ottawa, it all begins with the volume held in Superior. Dr. Raymond Cho, the senior hydrologist who first flagged the anomaly, addressed a closed session of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society in late 2026. His closing remarks were not about policy or budgets, but about the cold, indifferent physics of the planet. We spent a century and a half believing we had mapped the limits of this land, he said. We treated the shield as an immovable object, but we forgot that water is the ultimate solvent. It found a weakness we didn't know existed, a remnant of a sea that vanished hundreds of millions of years ago, and it is reclaiming its path. We are not in a position to reverse this. We are in a position of witnessing. The data as of April 2026 confirms his assessment. The water level gauges at Marathon and Terrace Bay continue their steady daily march downward. Thomas Bazicki's boat is now permanently dry docked. The sandbar he found in March is now a peninsula. The intake margins in towns across the North Shore are being measured in centimeters, not meters. The tunnel is still there. It is growing. The seismic network continues to log the microtremors of a plate in distress, tracing the unseen fracture line through the heart of Ontario. Lake Superior, the inland sea that has defined the character of the Canadian North for 10,000 years, is bleeding into the earth. It has happened before in the deep time of our planet, and it is happening again. We are merely the generation that happens to be standing on the shore.